The bank gave me 48 hours. My neighbor laughed, pointing his cigar at the $500 pile of scrap metal sitting in my driveway. That rust bucket won't harvest a single stalk, he sneered. He was right about one thing: it wasn't just a machine. It was my family's last hope. The smell of vaporized diesel and catastrophic failure hung thick in the crisp October air. I stood at the edge of the lower 100, the most fertile, heavily planted 100 acres on the Pendleton family farm, staring at the smoking corpse of my Case IH 1680. A thrown rod had blasted straight through the engine block, leaving a jagged, oil-spewing hole the size of a dinner plate. The machine was dead, and along with it, so was my farm. "Gabriel, we're out of time." The voice belonged to Richard Boyle, the senior loan officer at Oakhaven First National. He had driven his spotless silver Mercedes out to the edge of my dirt field just to deliver the final blow. Richard wasn't a bad man, but he was a company man, and the company was done waiting. "I need the yield from this 100 acres in the silos by Friday, Artie," Richard said, adjusting his tie against the prairie wind. "If you can't cover the margin, the bank initiates foreclosure on Monday." "I'm sorry, I really am." He drove away, leaving me suffocating in the silence of an unharvested field. The corn was perfect golden, dry, and heavy. It was a bumper crop, the kind that could easily wipe out my debts and secure my family's future for the next decade. But unharvested corn is just bird food. Furthermore, the local weather station was screaming about a massive, unseasonal derecho storm front moving down from the Dakotas. In 3 days, a wall of wind and hail was going to flatten Oakhaven County. I needed a combine, and I needed one yesterday. Renting was impossible. Every machine in a 200-mile radius was booked solid by the mega farms trying to beat the exact same storm. Buying a new one, or even a functional used one, required hundreds of thousands of dollars I didn't have. Desperation drove me to Miller's Salvage and Auction that afternoon. It was a graveyard of rusted iron, stripped engines, and broken dreams. Dale Higgins, the auctioneer, was rushing through the lots, his voice a rapid-fire drone over the crackling PA system. A crowd of local farmers stood around, mostly looking for spare parts or cheap project tractors. And then there was Clayton Gable. Clayton owned the neighboring 3,000 acres. He was the kind of modern corporate farmer who managed his fields from an iPad in an air-conditioned office. He had a fleet of brand-new $500,000 John Deere X9s, and he had been trying to buy my family's land for pennies on the dollar for 5 years. "Tough break about the case, Pendleton," Clayton said, wandering over to me with a fresh, unlit cigar clamped in his teeth. His sympathy was as fake as a $3 bill. "Here, the bank is circling. Offer still stands. I'll take the lower 100 off your hands. Save you the embarrassment of a public auction." "I'm not selling, Clayton," I muttered, gripping the edge of my jacket. "Suit yourself," he chuckled. "But unless you're planning on picking 100 acres by hand before Thursday's hail, you're a dead man walking." The auctioneer's voice snapped my attention back to the lot. "All right, boys, moving on to lot 42. It's an antique. It's a classic. It's a 1,979 Gleaner L2, sold as is. Where is? Do I hear 1,000? The crowd parted, revealing the machine. It was a tragedy in galvanized steel. The tires were dry-rotted and flat. The cab glass was shattered. The header was bent, and the engine block was buried under a decade of grease, dust, and abandoned birds' nests. The rust was so thick on the side panels it looked like a severe skin disease. 500? Come on. Scrap weight alone is worth that, Dale pleaded. Nobody moved. Clayton snorted loudly. A crazy, desperate voice echoed in my head. I raised my bidding paddle. 500, I said. My voice cracked. The entire yard went dead silent. Heads turned. Dale Higgins blinked, shocked that someone had actually bid. "Sold! To Gabriel Pendleton for $500. Clayton Gable burst into roaring laughter, slapping his thigh. "Buying modern art, Artie? Or are you going to plant flowers in the cab?" That rust bucket hasn't turned a belt since the Reagan administration. You're going to harvest your crop with a museum piece? I ignored him, walking up to the hulking, rusted beast. I placed my hand on the cold, oxidized steel of the side panel. It was a $500 coffin, or a $500 miracle. I had 48 hours to figure out which. Dragging the Gleaner down County Road 9 behind my heavy-duty pickup was the longest, most humiliating drive of my life. The combine groaned and shrieked with every bump, leaving a trail of rust flakes and dried mud on the asphalt. Cars piled up behind me, honking impatiently. When I finally pulled it into my gravel driveway, my wife, Sarah, walked out onto the porch. She stood there, wiping her hands on a dish towel, staring at the mechanical corpse. "Gabriel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is that?" "That," I said, trying to force a confidence I didn't feel, "is how we save the farm." She looked from me to the machine, tears welling in her eyes. "Gabriel, it doesn't even have a steering wheel." She was right. The interior of the cab had been completely gutted. "I'll fix it," I promised. "I just need a little help." That help arrived 20 minutes later in a beat-up 1992 Ford Ranger. Old man Wyatt Harris stepped out, a lit cigarette hanging from his lips, and a toolbox the size of a coffin in the truck bed. Wyatt was a retired diesel mechanic and an old friend of my late father. There wasn't an engine on earth he couldn't coax back to life. Wyatt walked a slow circle around the Gleaner, kicking a flat tire. He didn't say a word for 3 full minutes. Finally, he spat into the dirt. "Artie, son, this ain't a machine. This is a crime scene. Can we make it run, Wyatt? I don't need it to be pretty. I just need it to cut 100 acres without stopping." Wyatt rubbed his grease-stained chin. "Let's pop the hood. Let's see how deep the rot goes." We spent the first 4 hours just clearing out debris. We shoveled out 3 generations of raccoon nests, pressure-washed the engine block, and bypassed a completely shattered electrical system. But as we dug deeper into the guts of the rusted beast, Wyatt went unnaturally quiet. He was shining a flashlight deep into the threshing cylinder, the heart of the combine, where the grain is separated from the stalk. "Well, I'll be damned," Wyatt whispered. "What? Is the rotor cracked?" I asked, my heart sinking into my boots. "No, Artie. Look here." Wyatt pointed his beam into the dark cavity. "This ain't factory stock. Someone completely rebuilt the internals before this thing got parked. This is a custom aftermarket Sunnybrook rotor, and these concaves are heavily reinforced. The exterior looks like hell, but the threshing system, it's practically bulletproof." A tiny spark of hope ignited in my chest. "The engine is a standard Allis-Chalmers diesel," Wyatt continued, his eyes lighting up with the thrill of the challenge. "It's seized, but I think it's just locked up from sitting, not from blowing. Go get the diesel fuel and the breaker bar. We're gonna soak the cylinders." What followed was a 24-hour montage of pure, grueling mechanical triage. We didn't sleep. We drank cold coffee and tore into the machine like mad scientists. The belts, the main drive belts, were dust. We cannibalized industrial conveyor belts from an abandoned rock crusher down the road and cut them to size. The hydraulics. The header lift pump was shot. We ripped the hydraulic pump out of my neighbor's wrecked dump truck and retrofitted the mounts with a blowtorch and a welder. The steering. I pulled the steering column and wheel out of an old junked golf cart and welded it directly to the Gleaner's steering shaft. By Tuesday afternoon, the sky to the northwest was turning a sickly, bruised purple-green. The wind was picking up, howling through the barn slats. The local meteorologist, Tom Skilling, had upgraded the storm warning. A historic derecho was forming, packing winds of up to 100 miles per hour and baseball-sized hail. It was set to hit at dawn on Thursday. We had less than 36 hours. I was lying under the combine, desperately tightening a rusted fuel line, when the crunch of gravel signaled an arrival. I rolled out to see Clayton Gable's brand new $800,000 John Deere X9 pulling up right next to my property line. The machine looked like a spaceship, gleaming green paint, massive dual tracks, and a cab that looked more luxurious than my living room. Clayton leaned out of his climate-controlled cab, holding a megaphone. "Hey, Dr. Frankenstein," Clayton's voice boomed over the wind. "You playing mechanic with your garbage while your farm dies? Sign the papers, Artie. The storm's coming. Save yourself the bankruptcy." I wiped a streak of black grease across my forehead, staring him down. I didn't say a word. I just looked at Wyatt, who was sitting in the driver's seat of the rusted Gleaner. "Hit it, Wyatt," I yelled. Wyatt turned the key. The starter whined. A heavy, sluggish chug. 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 Echoed from the block. Clayton laughed through the megaphone. "It's dead, Artie." "Give it the ether!" I screamed over the wind. Wyatt sprayed a massive dose of starting fluid straight into the air intake and cranked it again. Bang. A sound like a shotgun blast ripped through the yard as the engine fired. A massive cloud of thick, black, oily smoke shot out of the rusted exhaust pipe. showering Clayton's pristine green tractor in a fine mist of carbon soot. The engine screamed, rattled violently, and then, slowly, settled into a heavy, deafening, rhythmic roar. The Gleaner shook. Loose bolts rattled off the chassis, but the massive belts began to turn. The hydraulic pump whined, and slowly, agonizingly, the heavy, rusted header lifted off the ground. It was alive. Wyatt leaned out of the shattered cab window, a manic grin on his face, giving me a thumbs up. I looked back at Clayton, whose smug smile had vanished as he hastily rolled up his window to block the black smoke. I climbed up the rusted ladder, tapping Wyatt on the shoulder to take the golf cart's steering wheel. I looked out over the lower 100. The corn was thrashing in the escalating wind. "Let's go cut some corn," I said. The first stalks of golden corn hit the rusted cutter bar of the 1979 Gleaner L2 with the sound of 1,000 dry bones snapping. I sat in the shattered cab, my hands gripping the absurd golf cart steering wheel, while Wyatt stood behind me, holding onto the exposed roll cage. The noise was deafening. The straight-piped Alice Chalmers diesel engine roared like a wounded bomber plane, shaking every rivet and loose panel on the chassis. But as the first wave of corn fed into the belly of the beast, something miraculous happened. The heavy rhythmic thumping of the custom Sunnybrook rotor took over. It didn't choke. It didn't bog down. It ate the corn with a ravenous, unstoppable mechanical hunger. A thick cloud of dust and pulverized chaff exploded from the rear spreader, blowing away in the rising wind. I glanced over my shoulder, holding my breath, watching the grain tank behind the cab. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, a golden waterfall of perfectly shelled corn began pouring from the clean grain elevator. "Look at that!" Wyatt roared over the engine, slapping the roof of the cab. "Clean as a whistle, not a cracked kernel in sight." I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my throat. We were doing it. The $500 museum piece was actually harvesting. For the first 4 hours, we fell into a brutal, grueling rhythm. The lower 100 was a massive expanse, and the Gleaner was not a fast machine. While Clayton Gable's modern John Deere X9 could sweep through a field at 6 miles an hour, our rusted beast crawled at a steady, agonizing 2.5. But it never stopped. By 9 o'clock that night, the temperature plummeted. The sky above us turned a bruised ink black, devoid of stars. The derecho was gaining speed. The wind was no longer just blowing. It was screaming across the plains, flattening the tops of the unharvested corn and kicking up walls of topsoil that blinded us. Then, the first major disaster struck. We were 20 acres deep when the jury-rigged electrical system shorted out. A shower of blue sparks erupted from the steering column, and the 2 aftermarket halogen work lights I had bolted to the cab roof flickered and died. We were instantly plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. I slammed the hydro handle into neutral, bringing the massive machine to a halt. The engine idled loudly in the dark. "Lost the alternator!" Wyatt shouted, grabbing his heavy-duty flashlight and shining it over my shoulder. "Wiring harness is cooked. We've got no lights, Artie." "We can't stop, Wyatt. We lose the lights. We lose our sight lines. If I veer off the rows, I'll trample the crop." I looked at the fuel gauge, which was entirely decorative at this point, and then at my watch. It was 9:30 p.m. The storm was supposed to hit before dawn. We still had 80 acres left. Harvesting in the pitch black was suicide. Hitting a rock or a washout would shatter the header and end the harvest instantly. Suddenly, a pair of high beams cut through the darkness from the edge of the field. It was my wife, Sarah. She had driven her 2014 Ford F-150 out into the dirt, dodging the deep ruts. She pulled the truck parallel to the combine, illuminating the next 12 rows of standing corn in a stark, white glare. My two-way radio buzzed on my hip. "Gabriel, do you copy?" Sarah's voice crackled through the static. I grabbed the mic. "Sarah, you're a lifesaver, but you can't be out here. The dust is going to choke the truck's intake." "I'm not letting you lose this farm in the dark, Gabriel," she fired back, her voice fierce and unyielding. "I'll drive parallel to you. Keep the header in my lights. Do not stop moving." And so began the strangest, most desperate convoy Oakhaven County had ever seen. The rusted, roaring Gleaner crawled through the night, bathed in the headlights of a battered pickup truck. By 1 a.m., the wind had escalated to sustained gusts of 40 miles per hour. The corn was bending violently, making it incredibly difficult to feed into the header. Every hour, Wyatt and I would switch places. When the grain tank filled up, I would swing the massive unloading auger over to our grain cart, dumping the golden payload without ever stopping the machine. It was a chaotic ballet of diesel, dust, and sheer willpower. At 2:30 a.m., as we approached the property line that divided my farm from Clayton Gable's massive corporate operation, we witnessed a sight that almost made me stop the combine. Across the wire fence, bathed in the stadium-quality LED lights of his million-dollar equipment, was Clayton's flagship John Deere X9. It was sitting dead in the middle of a massive mud depression. The heavy, unseasonal humidity had created a treacherous sinkhole. I watched through the shattered window as Clayton stood outside his cab in the freezing wind, screaming into his cell phone. I tuned my radio scanner to the local agricultural channel just in time to hear his panicked voice. "I don't care what time it is. Send a technician. The electronic traction control module is throwing a fault code. The computer locked the tracks. It won't move." I looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at me. A slow, deeply satisfying grin spread across the old mechanic's grease-stained face. "Ain't no computers on a '79 Gleaner, Artie," Wyatt chuckled, tossing his cigarette out into the wind. "Just belts, pulleys, and American steel. Keep her straight." We blew right past Clayton. He turned and watched us, a $500 scrap metal zombie machine, illuminated by the headlights of a Ford pickup truck, steadily chewing through the crop while his state-of-the-art spaceship sat paralyzed by a software glitch. The look of utter disbelief on his face was something I will take to my grave. But the triumph was short-lived. At 3:15 a.m., the first drops of rain began to fall. And they weren't just drops. They were heavy, freezing bullets of water that slapped against the exposed metal of the combine. The derecho had arrived early. "Wind is shifting," Wyatt yelled over the rising roar of the storm. "It's coming straight out of the north. We're losing the window." Crack. A massive bolt of lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, illuminating the lower hundred in a flash of blinding white. The thunderclap that followed shook my bones. In that brief flash of light, I saw it. The terrifying, towering black wall of the derecho front, consuming the horizon. It looked like a solid tsunami of clouds and dirt bearing down on us. We had 10 acres left. Maybe 45 minutes of cutting. "Push it!" I screamed, shoving the hydro handle forward. The engine lugged, black smoke billowing from the exhaust as the heavy wet stalks began to feed into the machine. The moisture was making the corn tough, forcing the custom Sunnybrook rotor to work twice as hard to thrash the grain from the cobs. The machine began to shudder violently. The belt screamed in protest. Snop. The steering wheel suddenly went limp in my hands. The combine instantly lurched hard to the left, the header plunging toward the dirt. "I lost steering!" I yelled, slamming the brakes. The golf cart steering shaft had sheared clean off under the heavy vibration and the strain of the mud. "Don't stop!" Wyatt bellowed. He dove under the steering column, pulling a massive, heavy-duty pair of vice grips from his overalls. He clamped the steel jaws directly onto the jagged, spinning nub of the broken steering gear. "Grab it," Wyatt ordered. I grabbed the handles of the vice grips. It was like trying to wrestle a live alligator. Every rut in the field, every rock, sent a violent shockwave up my arms. I had to use every ounce of upper body strength just to keep the machine moving in a straight line. The rain was coming down in sheets now, blowing horizontally through the shattered cab windows, soaking us to the bone. Sarah's truck was swerving in the mud, her headlights barely cutting through the torrential downpour. 5 acres left. The wind hit 60 miles per hour. The sound was apocalyptic. The unharvested corn around us was being whipped and shredded. I could hear the distinct, terrifying sound of hail beginning to mix with the rain, small at first, pinging against the steel roof, then growing to the size of marbles. "Come on, you beautiful rust bucket. Hold together." I prayed aloud, my hands bleeding and blistered against the steel handles of the vice grips. The engine temperature gauge, the only dial that still worked, was pegged firmly in the red. The Alice Chalmers diesel was quite literally boiling its own coolant. A distinct smell of burning rubber filled the cab as the main drive belt began to slip against the wet pulleys. 2 acres. "She's gonna blow, Artie," Wyatt warned, his eyes glued to the smoke pouring out from under the side panels. "Let her blow. Just give me 3 more minutes," I roared back. The hail was golf ball size now, shattering the mirrors on Sarah's truck and denting the hood of the combine. We were cutting through the final rows of the lower hundred. The grain tank was overflowing, golden corn spilling over the edges into the mud. but I couldn't stop to unload. We hit the edge of the field. The header cleared the final stalk. "Done! We're done! Kill the header!" Wyatt screamed. I slammed the lever, disengaging the threshing system. The sudden lack of resistance caused the overheating engine to surge wildly before I finally pulled the kill switch. The monstrous roar of the gleaner died, leaving only the deafening sound of the storm outside. We sat there in the dark, soaked, bleeding, and trembling. I looked out the broken window. The lower 100 was nothing but flat, sheared stubble. We had cut it all. "Get it to the barn, Artie," Sarah's voice came through the radio, strained but triumphant. "I'll meet you at the silos." The sun rose on Friday morning like an apology. The sky was a brilliant, bruised blue, and the air was still and cold. The devastation across Oakhaven County was absolute. The derecho had packed 80-mile-per-hour winds and baseball-sized hail. Trees were uprooted, power lines were down, and worst of all, the crops were decimated. I stood on the porch, a mug of black coffee in my bandaged hands, looking out at Clayton Gable's fields. His 3,000 acres of premium unharvested corn had been flattened into a tangled, rotting mat of organic destruction. His X9 was still stuck in the mud, surrounded by deep water. He had lost millions. The crunch of tires on gravel pulled my attention to the driveway. Richard Boyle's silver Mercedes pulled up, looking decidedly out of place among the mud and debris. Right behind him was Clayton Gable, driving a battered farm utility vehicle. Clayton looked exhausted, furious, and desperate. Richard stepped out of his car, holding a thick manila folder, the foreclosure paperwork. "Morning, Gabriel," Richard said quietly, his eyes scanning the yard. He saw the scorched, muddy, rusted carcass of the 1,979 Gleaner sitting half inside the barn, smelling of burnt oil and melted rubber. "I see the storm hit you hard. I'm really sorry, Artie. The bank needs the margin." Clayton walked up, a smug, vindictive sneer replacing his earlier desperation. If he couldn't have his crop, he was going to take my land to offset his losses. "Told you, Pendleton. You played mechanic with a piece of scrap while your farm died. Now, you're ruined. Sign the deed over to me right now, and I'll give you enough cash to move your family to a nice apartment in the city." I took a slow sip of my coffee. I didn't say a word to Clayton. I looked right at Richard. "Margin is due today, right, Richard?" "Yes, Gabriel, by noon, or the bank takes possession." I nodded. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. I walked down the porch steps and handed it to the loan officer. Richard frowned, adjusting his glasses. He looked at the paper, then he looked again. His jaw slowly dropped. Gabriel, this is a way ticket from the regional grain elevator. Issued at 6 a.m. this morning," I replied smoothly. "Wyatt and I spent the last 3 hours trucking our grain from the silos to the regional hub." Clayton scoffed, crossing his arms. "What grain? You cut maybe 5 acres before that rusted piece of junk died." "Read the numbers, Richard," I said, ignoring him. Richard's voice trembled slightly. 220 bushels an acre. From a 100-acre lot. 22,000 bushels. Clayton froze. The color instantly drained from his face. "That's impossible." "It gets better," I said, a slow smile creeping across my face. Because of the storm, regional grain reserves were totally wiped out. The spot price for premium, undamaged corn skyrocketed at 5 a.m. this morning. The elevator paid me a premium. The total yield covered the bank's margin, paid off the remaining mortgage on the land, and left me with enough cash to buy a brand new engine for my Case IH. Clayton stepped forward, his face red with rage. "You're lying. There's no way that garbage disposal harvested 100 acres of wet corn without cracking the kernels. The elevator wouldn't accept it." "Actually," Wyatt said, stepping out from the barn and wiping a wrench on a rag, "that garbage disposal had a custom Sunnybrook threshing rotor in it. Thrash is a hell of a lot cleaner than those factory electronics you run, Clayton. Your X9 throws out about 4% cracked grain. Our rust bucket, less than 0.5%. The elevator boys said it was the cleanest load they'd seen all year." Richard Boyle closed the folder, a genuine smile breaking across his face. He handed the way ticket back to me. "Well, Gabriel, it seems Oakhaven First National has no business with you today. Congratulations, your farm is secure." He shook my hand, got back into his Mercedes, and drove away. Clayton stood in the driveway, looking between me, Wyatt, and the smoking ruin of the Gleaner. He had nothing to say. He turned on his heel, got into his utility vehicle, and sped off toward his ruined, flattened empire. I walked over to the barn and stood next to the $500 machine. The tires were shredded. The engine was completely seized from the heat. The belts were melted piles of slag. It would never run again. It had given its mechanical life for this farm. Sarah walked out, wrapping her arms around me as we looked at the rusted metal giant. "What are we going to do with it?" she asked softly. I patted the oxidized, dented side panel. "We're going to build a shed around it, right here, and we're going to leave it exactly as it is. Because some heroes wear capes, and some heroes are made of 1,979 galvanized American steel." If you loved this story of grit, grease, and beating the absolute odds, hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves a good underdog story. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on more incredible, real-life farming dramas. See you in the next one.